everyone. My name is Emt. We are live streaming today from Global Yaakil. I'm interviewing our famous Professor Dan Connell. He's been a participant, observer of Eritrean scene for nearly 5 decades, starting in the 1970s during the liberation struggle. He followed events in the country closely as a journalist, an analyst, and eventually as academic, writing hundreds of articles and papers about the country's successful rejection of Ethiopian rule and its adoption of bold and creative approaches to the challenges of development and national building. Having marched and sheltered under fire alongside the liberation fighters, he came to know the leaders of the country intimately. But over the years, increasingly troubled by the repressive stance of Isaias Afwerki government towards the press and political opposition, he's found himself shifting from being a long-standing supporter to a critique of Isaias Afwerki and its regime. Welcome, Dan. And you're going to give me an option to call you either Professor Dan or Dan Connell or whichever it is, but welcome.
Thank you very much, Emt. No, I'm comfortable with Dan. That's all right. We know each other now, so
awesome.
Feel free.
Awesome, awesome. So my first question goes for you that can you start telling us about your early intimate relationship with Eritrean freedom fighters and their leadership? How much of the liberation fighters were more democratic, team-oriented, rather than what we're seeing now, just very autocratic and individualism?
Well, my engagement with Eritrea came actually after I was already in Ethiopia. I went to Ethiopia as part of a trip to Africa in 1975. I had planned to spend a year on the continent after many years of following the liberation struggles, the decolonization movement in Africa, and being involved in political movements in the U.S. for social justice and freedom, from civil rights to the protests against the war in Vietnam, which I mention in a way just because protesting against my government has been a part of me ever since I've been a child. It's a very big part of a democratic upbringing. But I was drawn to the countries that were in the process of redefining themselves, emerging from the colonial era and choosing new paths for themselves. My initial interest had been in the struggles in Southern Africa, and particularly South Africa, where the struggle against the racist apartheid system drew me because of this, the resonance it had with the situation in the U.S. But I was drawn on the way to Ethiopia, partly because it was going through a profound transition of its own under the Derg. Haile Selassie had been overthrown by a self-declared socialist junta, which was going to transform Ethiopia into a revolutionary paradise. And it was being supported by the United States, which is an anomaly that I could not resist. As an American, I had an interest in the situation there and a responsibility too, because the U.S. had been supporting Ethiopia from the 1940s, from the early 40s, even before we got into World War II. It was the entry point for the U.S. in the continent. And there were bases there, of course, in Eritrea and a very big presence in Addis. So I went to Ethiopia in the fall of 1975. And it was while I was there that two things happened. One, I saw firsthand the contradictions of the Derg and the fact that the rhetoric didn't match the reality. And we'll come back to that issue later, I know. But I traveled out into the countryside in Ethiopia, in the Ogaden region in the southeast, in Wollo, and eventually into Tigray, and elsewhere. And wherever I went, I saw that the regime was not involved in transformational activity with the people. On the contrary, it was channeling resources into a war in the north of the country that no one seemed to know much about, in a place called Eritrea. There were no journalists allowed, so there was no coverage of this. It was as if it didn't exist. But the more I heard about it, the more it seemed to me to hold a key to understanding what was wrong in Ethiopia, what was wrong in the relationship between the U.S. and Ethiopia as well, because we were pumping arms and equipment still into the country at that point. So at one point, I had the experience actually of speaking with an Eritrean in Addis and on Churchill Boulevard, who had been friendly, and he offered to show my friend and me around, and thugs came up from Ethiopia's security service and beat him into the ground because he was talking to a foreigner, and they assumed that as an Eritrean he would have been talking politics. In fact, he hadn't been. But it sent a clear message to me that there was more below the surface here that needed to get unpacked. So I asked more people about it. I heard more about it. This is when I really learned about the struggle, was in Addis, and from Eritreans who were there. So I got permission to go up into Wollo and Tigray from the Relief and Rehabilitation Commission, the RRC in Ethiopia, to go look at the feeding centers that were taking care of the people who are the victims of the previous famine in 1973-74. And that's what I had been looking at, was what is the government doing for the poorest in its countryside, as a way of understanding who it was. So I got the permit. We went up to Wollo, and on from there into Tigray on our way toward Eritrea. I took the opportunity once we were out to keep going. So the two of us, my friend and I, started hitchhiking. She spoke Italian, so we started meeting Eritrean truck drivers. And we got up into Maichu, anybody who knows where that is. And there we met two Eritreans who were driving back to Asmara in two little Volkswagens that they were transporting. They'd come in through Dire Dawa and they were driving them back up to Asmara. When we explained to them what our interest was, that we wanted to know what was going on in Eritrea and what was the role the U.S. was playing there, they invited us along, took us north to Mekelle, talked to friends there, got us a permit to go on the convoy, and then we went up north to Aksum and waited until there was a convoy. Finally, after about a week, we got a call to come to Adwa. The convoy assembled at 5:30 in the morning, and then some 500 vehicles moved from there across the border and into Eritrea. That was my first trip. We were trying to understand something about the liberation struggle. We were hoping we wouldn't be ambushed on the way. We weren't, luckily. But the second day we were in Asmara, the colonel who had led the convoy was assassinated in an attack by the EPLF. It was set up by his so-called girlfriend, who ran a bar right off of what's now Haranet Avenue. And that, of course, is the first chapter of Against All Odds, my first book.
Yes.
But that's how I got drawn into it. Now, what happened then was that I traveled around the city and asking people what was going on there. The situation deteriorated quickly. By the second day after that assassination, Ethiopian troops shot up the city. We all went into a kind of state of emergency and under curfew. People had to be back in their rooms at dusk. But as I moved around in the daytime after that, people were saying to me, this is normal for us up here. This is what happens. And all the troops that I was seeing carrying these kinds of operations out were wearing US Army uniforms, surplus uniforms. It was very disturbing to me. So I resolved at that point to find out more and to come back. We got out on an airplane back to Selassie and took bus and truck to get back to Addis. I set out to write a story about this, and in the process, when I was in Addis, I had been talking to somebody in the U.S. Embassy who was disturbed at the policy of the U.S., and so he leaked to me some information on an upcoming campaign, the Woda Zamach, as it was called, to try to recapture Eritrea from the rebels, because at that point, the EPLF and the ELF held most of the countryside. The government could only move about by armed convoy. So he leaked the story to me. I sent it off to the Washington Post. The Washington Post printed it on the front page of the paper, and I then launched my journalistic career. I had done some writing for small newspapers before that. I was an activist in college and university, writing for the student newspaper. I wrote for a black newspaper, actually, in Boston called the Bay State Banner at times. But this was really a launch for me into a new level of writing. I hopped on an airplane from there, went back to Sudan, met with the EPLF and the ELF, and asked them if I could go into Eritrea to see the situation from their side. It took 5 weeks to vet me. There was somebody in the office there who managed this for the EPLF. His name was Hagos Gebrahewitt, Hagos Kisha. And what they did was they sent information back to their people in Washington, who then investigated me. They asked me to write a biography of myself. They checked me out. They came back and said, finally, okay. And I understood their suspicion. I mean, with the U.S. being in the role that it was in Ethiopia. But eventually they approved. And as soon as they did, the ELF said yes. It's like, if you're going to go there, you can come here. So I made an arrangement to go 5 weeks into Eritrea, half with one front, half with the other. I traveled out to Port Sudan, where I was met by somebody else whose name will be familiar to some people. It was Naisgi Kiflu, who came to get me in a broken down Land Rover that had been captured. We drove in to Eritrea through northeastern Sudan. And then I traveled for 2.5 weeks. I had a young guy who was my guide. He didn't have any front teeth. It was kind of funny. It was a guy named Sabhat Ephraim. His teeth had been shot out in a training accident. But that was my first introduction. Nobody from the leadership identified themselves as a leader. Sabhat didn't tell me who he was. He was just a cadre who was assigned to be my guide. I was in Philphil and met a lot of the leadership at one point. Didn't know it because they didn't identify themselves. And then I got put with the ELF, traveled around Asmara with them, came back out near to Tessenai, saw both sides of the struggle. And what impressed me about each front really was that they were involved more in social, economic, and political activity than they were military. So from the outside, you know, you see an armed liberation front fighting for independence. On the inside, you saw two political movements trying to create the basis for a new state. They were doing agricultural extension work. They were doing support work with merchants for trade. They were doing land reform projects. They were reorganizing village administration from the traditional, basically, chieftaincy to tapping into the tradition of village elders in the highlands and building village committees. it was a fascinating process. And it was that transformational approach to the struggle that it seemed to me that it gave people a stake in the struggle that was well beyond just getting the Ethiopians out and putting a flag up. It was something tangible that they would get from the struggle. And it motivated people in a way that helped to equalize the balance of force between a very tiny country in the north and a very big country supported by a superpower to the south. I left at that point determined to come back and learn. Pardon me?
Your volume went off.
Are we back on? Do you have me again?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, so in that summer when I left, I went back home. I wrote stories about it. I got it published in the Washington Post and other places, a newspaper in New York called The Guardian. And then I sat down and studied journalism, number one, so I could really be a professional journalist because I hadn't had that kind of training. And Eritrea, number two. In 1977, I went back, and then I went into Eritrea for 6 months with some breaks to go out to Sudan, but basically 6 months living inside with the fighters to see it from the inside. I was at that point given a pass that I could carry around, and I could basically go anywhere. There were bus services at that point that were running at night, so I could travel on my own anywhere in the country. It was the freest I'd ever been, and was for many, many years after that. In the middle of that, I made one side trip that is worth mentioning, and that was that in November, after I'd been there for 4 months already, I was hearing about another struggle taking place in Ethiopia, in Tigray, with a group called the TPLF. So I asked the people in EPLF, could I go travel down there to visit, to see it? They agreed. And I traveled to Tsorona with a guide from the local, from Dekamhare, who had been in the political office there. It was a guy whose nickname was China, Haile Samuel. And I went into Tigray with the TPLF. We went to Debradamo. I met a lot of people in the TPLF, saw them, came back, and was with the EPLF then until the end of January of 1978. I was also in Massawa in December during the fighting there, which was really a turning point in the war. It was the end of the EPLF advances. But by that time, I was deeply immersed in the situation. I was taken more, as I said in the beginning, by the transformational approach to the society itself than I was just the struggle for independence. It got infinitely more complicated in the end of 1977 and the early part of 1978 when the Soviet Union came in, which changed many things for many people, including here in the US. But for me, that was not the central issue. The central issue was, who are these fighters? What are they fighting for? And I kept going back, and I've been doing it ever since. But it was really those initial encounters that got me engaged.
Have you gotten a chance to intimately get to know some of the leaders, and I've read some of your commentary that you knew some of them from their leadership and personal as well. So can you talk about a little bit about that as well?
Sure. When I went back the second time, I met people by name and by position. So then people said who they were. And I started meeting with Isaias every time I went, and we would sit down together. Mostly it was interviewing and talking about the situation. I spent a lot of time with Haile Wildetensai Duro, who I got a lot of tutoring on what they were doing politically. And I got to know Wode Solomon fairly well. Petros Solomon, of course, who I met in Zager, a village where I spent a lot of time. And I met many other people, but I think those were maybe the people that I started to get to know the most. Starting in the 77, 78, really. I got closer to Yemeni Gebrab, who had been in the U.S., who I had actually met in New York for the first time in 1976. No, 1977, in March of 1977, when he and Hagos critiqued some articles I'd written. This wasn't right. This wasn't right. It was a very controlling approach, but we had a fairly active relationship from then on. So yes.
And
short answer.
And you want to tell us a little bit about the picture behind you? I know in an earlier conversation you mentioned.
Right. Well, that's really from the 90s. So in the late 70s, things changed a lot with the Soviet intervention and the withdrawal back into the countryside. 1979, I made a big trip to Eritrea, walking behind the lines up to Asmara, seeing the situation outside of where most people were. And then in the 1980s, I started an aid organization, Grassroots International. 1990s, I was back again for right after the war was over in the fall of 1991. And then again in 92, 93. And then at that time, it was a very hopeful situation in Eritrea. There was hope that there would be a transition to a more democratic future. And the Constitution Commission was a big part of that. That poster was the promotional poster for the Constitution Commission. And I clipped the text off the bottom when I posted it up there. But there's a picture there of a tank, a T-55 Russian tank that had been captured by EPLF, sinking into the sand as the sun rises behind it. And it symbolized the end of a 30-year war and the onset of peace and the hope for prosperity and peace in the future. I keep that there to remind me that this is still in Eritrea's future.
Absolutely. So let's move to the next question, which I have been really excited to talk to you about, which is the era of like post-independence and after that romantic time of, earning our independence and the government moving to a direction of dissolving any non-government organizations such as the Regional Center for Human Rights and Development, the dissolving of village self-governing. And these are the most important things, that really is the fabric of Eritrean society, and just basically eradicating any traditional democratic practices to a single man dictatorship. So there's a lot of details, and I know I'm asking a lot of questions, but if you can kind of give us like bullet points of what happened past the independence and to now make it a single man dictatorship country.
Okay, well, I have to go back just a little bit to get there.
Sure.
First of all, during this struggle, I clearly bought into the notion that the need for secrecy, for authority, discipline, trumped everything, to coin a phrase. And it was necessary to make the liberation struggle as efficient and effective as possible. And so I bought into this with some caveats. One, I had the experience in the mid-'80s with Isaias of having started this aid agency, Grassroots International, that I mentioned. And then it was, you know, it was a fly-by-night operation. We had started with a little bit of money after I left an organization called Oxfam America, if you know what it is.
Yep.
And I had been hired by them actually in '83 to go into Lebanon. So I was in Beirut during the Israeli invasion, and because I had had experience in a war zone, because I had been in Lebanon before, which is another story. I was hired by them to put together an emergency program. I left Oxfam a year later to start Grassroots International with an aim to be involved in Eritrea and Lebanon and Palestine and other areas of struggle where there was both need and opportunity for transformational change. So we soon got involved in South Africa after all. But in the 84, 85 period, when the famine finally came to public awareness through the big famine, the Africa famine in 83, 84 really broke into the news in October, November of 84, when the BBC broadcast pictures of starving people in Tigray. That was then rebroadcast in the US on NBC TV. And all of a sudden, everybody woke up to the fact that there was this terrible famine in Ethiopia because of drought. Well, we knew at Grassroots that it wasn't just drought, it was war. It was a man-made crisis, and it was worse in places like Sudan, Angola, and other places where there was also civil wars going on. So it was a mix, really, of natural and man-made causes. So Grassroots International started saying this. We got a lot of attention. We started raising funds for the first time. I had been actually painting houses to pay my own salary while I was doing this before that, because we didn't have any money coming in. But then we took some of the money that we raised and we invested in the Eritrean Relief Committee in the US and also in Relief Society of Tigray, REST, to build them up so that they could work within their communities and also to introduce them into the NGO community. There was a big trade association of NGOs. We got them involved in that. And we started talking with media about the situation, telling them they only had half the story. So we took an NBC camera team into Tigray at the time. We couldn't get them into Eritrea. We had a Christian Science Monitor reporter we took to Eritrea. We set up an office in Tigray, in Khartoum, to educate journalists who were pouring in from all over with no knowledge of the situation to report on a famine. And we set them up so that they would meet people from the Eritrean offices and the Tigray offices. So we were providing an avenue for more information, more advocacy, and more money that we were sending to ERA, the Eritrean Relief Association in Eritrea. What happens? I get a message from Isaiah saying, shut this organization down. We have our own organization. We don't need yours. This from a guy who I had known so well, we talked about that we could meet every time I went into Eritrea. Personal matters didn't affect his judgment then, and they never have. He's not a sentimental guy. But political judgments that involved anything other than his ability to control the situation were obviously impossible to get past. And I learned a hard lesson there, that he is more interested in control than in solidarity and in relationships. I still kept going back because I was never there just for one person. I just don't think that that's the way movements, governments, and people work. There's much more going on in Eritrea than him. I pursued my other relationships. I went back. I still interviewed him when I went. I refused to dissolve the organization. Another member of our board, an Eritrean you may know, Barakat Haile Selassie, was told he should quit the board. He refused also. Because we were doing something nobody else could do as an American intermediary on that. I tell that story to say I have not had any illusions about the leader of Eritrea since that time. But I had a very different picture of Eritrea as a whole. And I came into the 90s thinking that here is a man with autocratic tendencies, but there is so much else going on in this movement that if there can be an institutional structure, a constitution in place, a constitutionally elected government, and a popular assembly, there will be checks and balances on him personally, and Eritrea can then go forward and struggle these issues out in a different way than they had before. I was naive. And the issue that you raised about the Regional Center for Human Rights and in the early 90s being shut down was a key signal of that. There were others too. There were daycare centers that were started by ex-women fighters who were shut down because there was the women's union and that had to run everything. An independent daycare center was a threat. Anything that was not controlled by the party or the state, pretty much, was forbidden. So I started to argue about this with people like Yamani and others privately. I didn't make any public fuss about it. I still was a little wary of that. I regret that now. But I still had hope that once the Constitution was in place, things would change. I think actually the moment for change was the early 90s. And the first problem there was that after all that struggle, the EPLF wouldn't permit the ELF to come in as an organization. And the ELF represented a key constituency of the national struggle and a key constituency, a key segment of the population. So if it didn't have room at that moment for other Eritreans, what was the prospect for a future? I struggled with this throughout the 90s. When the war broke out with Ethiopia in 98, I was there supporting the struggle. I wrote about it on behalf of the Eritrean perspective. I went out to the front lines to Sorona again, and I was in Zalambasa and other places on the front lines, 98, 99. My wife was there during that time at one point too. But I had more and more questions that were coming up about the situation. And the fact that the government was not implementing the Constitution at that stage, ostensibly because you can't do it in wartime, but it's a nonsense argument. And you can have elections in wartime. I mean, lots of countries do. You could have had it in 98 before the war started. But the manner in which the war was being waged too, and the leadership struggles that were going on behind the scenes, which I was hearing a lot about from people that I knew very closely within it, told me at that point that there was really a coup taking place within the state, for a top-down coup in a sense, purging of critics from within the movement, unbeknownst to the rest of us outside because you couldn't see it perhaps. But I was hearing about it again from the inside. And I think that by the beginning of 2000, it was pretty clear that things were going in a very bad direction. And that whatever happened with the war was really a cover for this seizure of power. At this point in the beginning of 2000, I became increasingly convinced that one way to understand this was through the role of the secret party that had run the EPLF throughout its existence, the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party, or EPRP, which became known as the Eritrean Socialist Party toward the end, but that doesn't matter. The party, though, ran the whole organization. So when I was seeing the discipline in the 1970s of the fighters and hearing everybody almost give me the same answers to political questions, it was a little disconcerting. But the reason for it was that there was a party going on within the ranks of EPLF, organizing, politicizing, and maintaining control of all the decisions and strategies that the front then adopted in public. It was meeting in advance of the congresses of EPLF and deciding what the program would be, what the leadership would be, and then the front would meet and have a ostensibly democratic process that was already determined. So I started to investigate that party to find out more about it because I saw the same thing happening in the 90s. Was there a party? I still don't know the answer to whether there is, but it certainly behaves like one. But the party in its own way was more democratic then than the situation is today, but that's another question. But I also started then to interview people about the party, as you know, and one of the outcomes from that was a book called Conversations with Eritrean Political Prisoners. The first chapter in that was an interview with Haile Woldetensai, which I did in January, I think, or March of 2000 when he was foreign minister. And at that point, he told me, had already been telling me, there had been debates within EPLF about the conduct of the war and about the delays in implementing the Constitution. There had been struggles over this that had broken out also in a September meeting of the National Assembly and the Executive Committee of the party, the PFDJ, in which Isaias was criticized, and he basically kept quiet, but moved immediately after that to start setting in motion a purge. So by January of 2000, 2001, there were meetings going on in the ministries, and ministers were not invited. It was the mid-level cadre who were holding them. They were trashing the people at the top, and they were setting the stage for a purge of all of Isaias's critics.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that in your previous essay, you did mention two major tactics that Isaias really used to not create any concentrated power outside of him, which is basically dealing with the mid-level cadre to shaming their leaders and just kind of, decentralizing any leadership. And the second part is just shuffling power across the ministerial leadership and just kind of alternating people, freezing out people, and just kind of keeping the old school method of any autocratic leadership. So touch a little bit about that, and then we'll get to the meat and potato of today, which is the U.S. policy towards Eritrea.
Yeah, I mean, these are standard policies and strategies of any autocratic dictatorship. Haile Selassie used them in Ethiopia in the past. You see this particularly in China, and it's the Chinese experience, I think, that's had the most influence in Eritrea. Of course, Isaias was in China during the Cultural Revolution in 1968, and I think he took a lot of lessons from that experience. If you ever want to understand Eritrea's military strategy, go and read Mao's military writings. For example, the strategic retreat is a key part of that. But the notion of the vanguard party is also a crucial part of Maoist thinking, as is the strategy of renewing the party by attacking the leadership periodically and purging it at the top, and narrowing the circle of people who make decisions to those who are most loyal to the leader. Now, interestingly, we've seen something of that going on in the US over the last 4 years as well. You and I talked about that earlier. But one of the things that happens there is that the leader purges all the people who criticize and have a different view until they get people who either have the same views or keep their views to themselves. And I think it's two different possibilities here. But the result is that the leader gets no fresh input from any other source. You get surrounded by yes men, so to speak, sycophants, as we say. And the decision making itself gets worse and worse until you start making big mistakes. And I think that's where Isaias is today.
I love the term sycophants. I think that's quite a bit of a few followers of his with really not understanding his capability and the damage that he does, that they continue to support his way of leadership.
One other little thing. I mean, the trick to maintaining yourself in power there is to create an identification between the nation itself and you. And that's what Isaias has done. So when you or I are going to criticize Isaias, people say we're criticizing Eritrea.
Yeah.
No, I love Eritrea. I know you do too.
I do. I think that's a tactic of any government. I mean, we've seen it in the US as well, right? Anybody that criticized over the last year of the president, personal attacks, change of power, and things like that. So this is not unique to Isaias, but he does really, really expert level of controlling the country. So the hot topic that a lot of the viewers have been asking to have a conversation with you is that talk about U.S. policy and how does it work, particularly when it comes to Eritrea. Many of the diaspora hope for some positive influence, if there is any, from the current administration. And if you can just kind of share some of your input, how U.S. policy have been able to influence the region, particularly in Eritrea. Are there any outside players that we should be keeping in mind in current situations? So if you can talk to us a little bit about that.